Hi, and welcome back. In this video, I will show you an end-to-end tutorial on how to set up Business Central with Dime.Scheduler. We'll start from scratch, and by the end of the video, we'll have a fully functioning version of Dime.Scheduler that is connected to Business Central. What we're going to do essentially is follow this guide that we see on screen. I will post the link in the description of this video so you can follow along. So let's get started. There are about 5 hoops we have to jump through, and arguably the first step would be the most complicated one, because that's where we'll create a new version of Business Central. And we're going to run BC locally on a Docker container. Of course, this step is optional, so if you have a Business Central test environment lying around somewhere, you can use that, but what we're going to show here is a very quick way to get started with minimal effort. The second step is quite easy. We'll just make sure we have a Dime.Scheduler environment at our disposal and create the initial user accounts so you can move on with the next 3 steps. Step 3 and 4 is Business Central work, so we're going to install the extension for Dime.Scheduler in Business Central, and followed by the configuration of the FastTrack wizard in Business Central. And the last step is to synchronize Dime.Scheduler back to Business Central. And by the end, when we complete these 5 steps, we'll have a fully functioning version of Dime.Scheduler that is connected to Business Central. What we're going to do basically is set up Business Central, set up Dime.Scheduler, and then connect the 2 systems. As you probably guessed, this video is going to be slightly technical, so if you have prior experience with Business Central, with Dime.Scheduler, with PowerShell, and optionally Docker, that will help you a great amount to successfully complete this tutorial. Before we move on to the nitty-gritty part, here's a brief reminder that Dime.Scheduler is an extension for ERP systems like Business Central. But while it is an extension, it doesn't run within the runtime of those ERP systems. It runs somewhere else. But even though it runs somewhere else, Dime.Scheduler cannot work by itself. It needs data from the back office system to do the planning part properly. Dime.Scheduler then was built for integration in mind with any system that you can possibly think of. And to achieve that, it's all about web services. Data comes in from the back office system through our REST API, and when the planner does the planning, we're going to invoke any web API that wants to be notified of the new planning data. So that's basically what we're going to do here today, is set up the integration through the web services from and to Dime.Scheduler. Communication then is bidirectional. The message flow from the back office system to Dime.Scheduler revolves around our import API. Any data that you want to make available in Dime.Scheduler can be done through this RESTful API. You can invoke this API directly, or you can use our developer tools like the SDKs we have. We have a CLI. Perhaps you want to use our standard connectors that we develop and maintain for certain back office systems. And you can always use the connectors that our resellers have developed earlier. When we look at the other direction, we'll find that it's not that straightforward to synchronize planning data from Dime.Scheduler to the back office system, because it completely depends on the back office system how they expose their integration layer. We do have a number of standard connectors that we can use to synchronize data to systems like Business Central, to Outlook, to the Power Platform. And if need be, we can always use our all-purpose generic webhook connector. Now, of course, today our focus is Business Central. There is a standard extension for Dime.Scheduler in Business Central that you can use to quickly connect the 2 systems. It is a batteries included experience with built-in capabilities to send and receive data such as service orders, jobs, production orders, assembly orders, sales orders, and so on. The extension itself is wafer thin and allows you to customize and make bespoke solutions for your customer. And due to its tiny footprint and due to the architecture of Dime.Scheduler itself, it is a very low-risk endeavor to plug in Dime.Scheduler to Business Central. I think that's enough theory for now. Let's get to the action. If you want to follow along with this guide, I'd suggest that you install the latest version of PowerShell Core, that you have Docker Desktop with Windows containers, that you install a little tool called ngrok, and obviously have a valid license for BC and some administrative rights to your PC. All right, it's time for some action. And step number 1 is a biggie. We are going to set up Business Central. We are going to run Business Central locally on a Docker container. Again, if you already have a Business Central environment lying around somewhere, you're going to go ahead and use that. If not, just follow the instructions that we're going to show you in the next couple of minutes. I have been able to squeeze the entire step into one single slide. And it basically boils down to starting Docker Desktop, switching to Windows containers, and installing a PowerShell script that we've published on the PowerShell gallery. And that script will create a Docker image and instantiate a container that runs Business Central in it. The first thing that we need to do is open up Docker Desktop and ensure that we are currently running Windows containers instead of the default Linux containers. Otherwise, the PowerShell script that we're going to run in a second will fail, and we won't have a Docker container with Business Central on our machine. So make sure that you are currently on the Windows containers mode in Docker Desktop. And once you have done that, we can proceed and install the PowerShell script that we've published on the PowerShell gallery, which will then deploy Business Central on your Docker desktop. Don't forget to run PowerShell Core as administrator, otherwise the scripts will fail. The first script that I've copied right here will download the PowerShell script from the PowerShell gallery. Once that's installed, we can move into the current directory where that script is installed. We can just copy paste this code right here, and then just invoke that particular PowerShell script. This PowerShell script, by the way, is just a wrapper around the BC container helper module that Microsoft has developed. This is just a very quick way to simply deploy a Business Central container without having to worry about the parameters and the configuration of that. So at this point, when I evoke the script, it may take a while because it will download the images, it will download the base layers, and then deploy Business Central on a fresh container on your local machine. So this may take a while. I'll move forward and fast forward this video until the time it has completed its process. If all went well, we should see at the bottom this green line that says the container has been successfully created. If that's true, we can have a look at Docker Desktop and see if there's an image and a container for that image. So let's see if that's the case. We can go back to the images section of Docker Desktop. We see there's an image for Business Central, and then there should be an instance of that image. And we can see BC24 has been created. We can go into that image and then we see pretty much the same output as the one we have here in this PowerShell terminal. And then we can navigate to this web client right here, this BC24/BC. That's where Business Central can be accessed from. So we can go to this terminal and then we can control click. That opens up a tab in the browser, or you can just copy it and paste it in your browser manually. So if we do that, we can go right into Business Central 24. By default, if you use this script, we're going to use the extremely safe combination admin, and then you can sign in and access Business Central. And then we can move on to the next step, and then configure Dime.Scheduler and then connect the two systems together. If this is the first time you log in, it may take a while before Business Central has warmed up, but it will get there eventually. So there we go. One script and we have Business Central running on Docker locally on your machine. Not too shabby. The only reason for the existence of this PowerShell script that we've deployed on the PowerShell gallery is to give you a quick way to deploy and instantiate a Business Central container on your machine. It is, as I said before, pretty much a wrapper around the BC Container Helper module that Microsoft has published. So if you want to have complete control, you can either customize the script that we deployed or just directly invoke the BC Container Helper module. The only thing that at the end you should care about is the output that comes in the PowerShell terminal. And more specifically, you want to have access to the web client. The added benefit of the script that we provide is that it also creates a hosts entry in the hosts file, so you don't have to use the IP address, but you can use a human readable string to access Business Central on that Docker container. Surely I don't need to remind you that you should never ever use the script for production purposes. Docker containers are ephemeral, which means that all the data that lives inside of it will be destroyed whenever a Docker container is destroyed. This particular image also runs a SQL server, so whenever you delete the container, all the data will be removed as well. Docker containers are meant to be short-lived and not meant to have persistent storage in there. So this approach, this step one, is good for developers, for testers that want to have a quick environment to poke around and to connect it to Dime.Scheduler to evaluate and cases like that, but not for production, that's obvious. And that concludes step number 1. Step number 2 is a lot easier because it requires very little effort from your end. All you need to do is ask your reseller to get access to an environment or contact us directly for your free trial. We're going to go ahead behind the scenes and create an environment for you, and we'll send out an initial email to the person responsible to set up the connection between Business Central and Dime.Scheduler. So the initial user will be responsible for adding additional users and setting up the application. What I'm going to do now is move on to this temporary mailbox system and then create a user for this particular mailbox, just to show you the experience of the initial onboarding. So the invitation has been sent out, and there we go. Now we can access our instance of Dime.Scheduler. So we can confirm our account like so. Enter a safe account password, and then we'll be able to log in just like that. Let's set our time zone, language, and there we go. We are good to go. And as you can see, everything is empty, which is what we're going to address in the next couple of steps to bring over data from Business Central to Dime.Scheduler. We are ready to go to the next step, which is to install the extension for Dime.Scheduler in Business Central. And the experience is pretty much the same as step number 1. We basically have to download a PowerShell script from the PowerShell gallery and then invoke that script to deploy the extension to the instance of Business Central that we are targeting. Could be the Docker image, or it could be a Business Central environment that's running somewhere on your network. The first thing that we need to do is open the BC PowerShell prompt. If you are following along with this tutorial, you'll see a couple of icons will have been added to your desktop, and these icons give you access to that Docker container that we just deployed. So double click on that, and then it will open up the prompt for that Docker container. So here we are now with the terminal open, ready to go to install the extension. So now then you can run the commands that are listed on this slide. This will download the script from the PowerShell gallery. It's been installed, so let's put our current directory to that directory where that script was installed, just like before. And now we can invoke the PowerShell script with the parameters for that BC instance. So by default, the server instance of the script that we use is BC, and the version at this time of writing was number 24. So this will download the extension for Dime.Scheduler and will deploy it to that instance of BC that we specified here. This script, by the way, again, is a wrapper around the trusty commands that you're used to install, synchronize, and publish the app to Business Central on-prem. If you're using Business Central Cloud, all you need to do is go to the app source, download the extension for Dime.Scheduler, and then you have the same result as we have right here. So within a couple of seconds, if we go back to Business Central, we should be able to find Dime.Scheduler artifacts. And one of the quick ways to find that is just enter the Dime.Scheduler FastTrack wizard. Now you see the extension is available and ready to use. And then we can move on to actually run this wizard and send over data from Business Central to Dime.Scheduler. Let's move on to the penultimate step. Step number 4 is to connect and send data over from Business Central to Dime.Scheduler. And using our standard connector, we can use the FastTrack wizard to quickly enable some modules and configure how Business Central should behave and should send data over to Dime.Scheduler. The FastTrack wizard is a very quick way to get started, but again, as mentioned at the introduction, it is very easy to customize and deviate from the quick start behavior that this FastTrack wizard tries to achieve. So let's go to Business Central and enable some modules that we can quickly synchronize with Dime.Scheduler. In Business Central then, simply hit Alt-Q and then start typing Dime.Scheduler FastTrack wizard. And then we can start configuring. The first step is quite crucial because that's where we'll establish the connection between Business Central and Dime.Scheduler. The first field is an important one. The source app is a string field that identifies all the data that we're going to send from this instance from Business Central to Dime.Scheduler. It's this field that allows you to plan multiple back office systems in one instance of Dime.Scheduler. Also, whenever you plan something on the planning board, we're going to use this source app field to know which instance of BC we should contact to write data back into Business Central itself. So make sure it is descriptive, it is unique for each system you want to plug it in. So for example, for my particular case, I can call this source app BC Docker test, for example. That will show quite clearly this is the test environment whenever we want to plan our data in Dime.Scheduler itself. The API type can remain REST service. The scheduler URL is the API endpoint of Dime.Scheduler. So that's a fixed address. So if you're using the sandbox, that should be sandbox.api.dime.scheduler.com. If you are running a production for Dime.Scheduler, you can omit the sandbox. So it should be just api.dime.scheduler.com. And then you can keep it as it is. For the next couple of fields, we are going to go back to Dime.Scheduler and create a service account. You can use the same account as we logged in, but it's a best practice to use a user account that's not linked to an actual physical person, because otherwise, if that person in Dime.Scheduler resets the password, the integration between BC and Dime.Scheduler will be broken, which is quite embarrassing if that will be uncovered. So back in Dime.Scheduler, what you do then is go to user setup, go to the users page, and then we can create a service account user. So make sure to give it a descriptive name. So for example, service account at yourdomain.com. And initially, by default, what we'll do in a second is when we create the user account, we're going to automatically generate a password for this user. It's not the best practice to keep it like that, but what you should do is just log in as user account in your inbox system and then reset the password and use that password to configure in Business Center. But to expedite proceedings, I'm just going to create this user and copy this password that we can then use to set up the extension and the connection. So let's keep that in a notepad. What I'm going to do next, not to forget, is to assign all the user roles to this particular user so it can access and write data into the system. Back in BC, we can then populate the scheduler user, which is this particular field. Make sure there's no white spaces in front of it and after. And then the password, we can do the same there. Whenever we hit the next button, we will ping Dime.Scheduler and see, can we access this account? Is the credentials, are they correct? If so, it will show connection okay. And now we have the connection with Business Central and Dime.Scheduler, and now we can configure the next couple of modules, and then we can send over data right away. The next step is to decide whether we want to enable resource planning. So should we use the resources table as a source to populate the planning board list with resources from this table? In 95% of the time, you will want to use this and potentially make more configuration to map fields from one dimension of one area to the fields that we provide in Dime.Scheduler. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to enable this module and also perhaps enable the service order module, just to show you how fast we can set up the integration. Let's enable that module. I'll try to keep the default as much as possible. Perhaps for the sake of this tutorial, let's change the duration or the default duration of an item to 8 hours. So whenever we drag and drop a task to the planning board, that length of the block will be 8 hours. The category is a visual indicator that renders the background color of appointments on a planning board. And that color can be linked to some property or some status of your work in Business Central. So for example, you can link a background color to a service order type. That's what we'll do here in this case. A time marker that renders an underscore, a thin bar at the bottom of appointments in the planning board. And it follows the same philosophy. You can link a color to some property and some status in BC. These are default options, but of course you can override that and use your bespoke fields and something else as a source to render these colors on the planning board. So let's use repair status for this visual indicator, and then we can move on with the next modules. The next modules are following the same principles. They will allow you to enable a certain table. If you want to use jobs planning, for example, just enable that and then configure how these jobs should behave in Dime.Scheduler. Likewise, for things like assembly planning, production planning, do you want to use machine centers? Do you want to use work centers? Do you want to use production orders? Whatever it may be, just enable as you go along, and what you want to plan, that's completely up to you. I'll just go ahead, click next, 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 until we can hit the finish button, at which point we'll trigger an initial sync and push the data that we can already use to Dime.Scheduler. So hit yes, and then within a couple of seconds, we'll have resources available in our planning board. So let's go and have a look-see if that all went well. Well, in the planning board, we now have all the resources that we have in this particular instance of Business Central. We have no data yet. That's because it's transactional data, so you don't want to send all the data initially. So what you can do as a test, go to the optional the module that you have activated and send over an instance or create a new one if you want to do that. So for most of the items that we support, most of the tables that we support, you can create an item, and then typically there will be an action in the actions menu on the ribbon. There will be a submenu for Dime.Scheduler, and then you can just send the order to the planning tool. When you hit that button, it will gather everything relevant for planning, things like service items, like address information, the service order type, and we'll make it available in the planning tool. So now we should see one new item, service order 8, should be pushed right onto our open task list. So the integration now between Business Central, from Business Central to Dime.Scheduler is now set up, and then we can start configuring Dime.Scheduler. Already start planning, but there's one caveat: it won't necessarily synchronize back to Business Central because there's a thing still missing for that part of the integration, which is what we're going to do in the last step, step 5. Before we do that, maybe I wanted to show you what happens if you try to plan a service order onto the planning board when the connection between Dime.Scheduler to Business Central hasn't been set up yet. Essentially, nothing will happen. You can plan and use the application as is, but whenever you drag and drop an appointment to the planning board, nothing will happen behind the scenes because we don't know yet where to send this data to. So we can have a look at the transactions table. You can right click on this appointment, go to the transactions, and then you'll see nothing has happened. There is no multi-back office connector provided. So we don't know what to do with that because there's no connector info known for this appointment. That's what we're going to address in step number 5 to make sure that every block on this planning board goes back to Business Central and is processed the way you want it to be processed. Step 5 then is all about establishing the message flow from Dime.Scheduler back to Business Central. Whenever we do something on the planning board, we want to make sure Business Central is nullified and potentially other systems like Outlook, like the Power Platform, like your bespoke applications can be nullified and can do their thing to make sure that planning data is processed the right way. And to do that, we can go back to Business Central and navigate to the web services table. And we are looking for one particular web service. It's called the Dime.Scheduler appointment card. And then you should scroll to the right and open up or copy the SOAP URL. If you click on that, it might prompt you with credentials. If you are following along with this tutorial, again, you can use admin in the prompt that will be shown, and then you should get access to this XML page. If you are following along with the tutorial, this link will not function with Dime.Scheduler because this BC24 entry is an entry in the hosts file on your local machine. Dime.Scheduler doesn't actually know what BC24 means. So what we need to do then is sort of a workaround, which I'll show you in a second. But if we're using a proper instance of Business Central that is known by the internet, that can be accessed through that DNS, you can leave it at that. So you can omit and forget about the next couple of minutes, which is only applicable to the local Docker containers. For those who are following along with the tutorial, the gist is that we need to find a way somehow to forward or map requests from our local host to an address that the internet can access. There are solutions out there. Probably the most famous one or the most popular one would be ngrok, which is a tunneling system that allows you to map web addresses to local addresses only known by your machine. I've already prepared a command here in the terminal, which will map our BC24 port 7047, which is the root of our web service address, with this particular domain that the internet does understand and does know what it can do with that. So if I hit enter, it will open up a tunnel and will forward requests from this web address to our local hosts. So what we're going to do here is copy this particular web address and then replace the root. So we need to change this part with this part. So we can skip all that, everything before the local address, and replace it with the address from ngrok. Now we can use this address to link Dime.Scheduler to Business Central. With this small digression behind us, we can now go back to Dime.Scheduler and navigate to the connectors setup page. Initially, this list will be empty, which means that we won't be able to send planning data back to any system, which is about to change when we add a new record. Let's give that a name, a description, and then the source application must be the same value as the field that you specified in the FastTrack wizard. So if we take a quick glance at the FastTrack wizard, we should copy this value and paste it in the source application field in this row. And then don't forget to tick this checkbox, because otherwise we won't send data back to this connector. The back office system in my particular case is on-prem Dynamics 365 Business Central, but you can use any other system that you want to use. So let's go for Business Central. The web service URL is the one we had in the web services list in Business Central. If you're using a local Docker, copy the ngrok URL or the tunnel URL that Dime.Scheduler can access. And then when we go in to use the Docker container script, you can use the admin password preceded by the prefix basic. So let's go for basic admin, and then the password is admin. Let's save that, and now we can try to plan something in for this source application. When we go back to the planning board, we can have a look at the same appointment we just planned in. We can have a look at the transactions again. And then if I redirect your attention to the source app in the appointment info card, you see the source app is BC Docker test, which is the same one we had in BC and which the one we configured just a second ago. But now we see that's the source app. Now we know there is a connector known for this source app. So we know where to send it to, what credentials to use, and so on. So if we were to reschedule this appointment or just retry in that settings page, refresh in this transaction page, you'll see the status is now succeeded. We can always double check by going to the planning board, right click on the appointment, navigate to the links section, and then open up the service order in Business Central. And for service orders, what we're going to do by default is create resource allocation lines for each block that we assign in Dime.Scheduler. So we can see this nicely shows up in Business Central as well. So now we have a connection set up from Business Central to Dime.Scheduler, and also vice versa. Whenever we plan something on our planning board, it goes back to Business Central. And with that, we have completed the circle. We started with a fresh instance of Business Central running locally on Docker on your machine, followed by configuration of Dime.Scheduler, the extension in Business Central. We ran the wizard to enable some modules, and we also set up the message flow from Dime.Scheduler back to Business Central. As you can imagine, there's a lot more to it, but I hope this gives you a rough idea how quickly you can set up Business Central with Dime.Scheduler. And I'll see you in the next video.